Woman thought her husband was poor. But at his funeral, she learned the truth. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. Margaret Collins stood at her kitchen window, watching the rain streak down the glass as she waited for the kettle to boil. The house felt impossibly quiet without Robert's gentle humming, without the soft shuffle of his worn slippers across the linoleum floor. 3 days had passed since the heart attack took him, and she was still adjusting to the silence that had settled over their modest two-bedroom home like a heavy blanket. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and surveyed the kitchen that had been her domain for 32 years of marriage. The same chipped countertops, the same avocado green appliances that Robert had insisted were perfectly good, long after they'd gone out of style, the same careful economy that had defined their entire life together. Margaret had always known she hadn't married for money. Robert Collins had been a bookkeeper at a small manufacturing company when they met, and he'd remained a bookkeeper until his retirement 5 years ago. His salary had been modest but steady, enough to keep them comfortable in their small house in a working-class neighborhood, enough to pay the bills and take a cautious vacation to the coast once a year. But comfortable had never been enough for Margaret. She'd grown up poor, truly poor, and had spent her adult life with the persistent fear that poverty might reclaim her at any moment. She'd wanted more: a bigger house, a newer car, clothes that didn't come from discount stores. She'd wanted the kind of life her friends from high school had built with their more ambitious husbands. Instead, she'd gotten Robert. Kind, gentle Robert, who darned his own socks and drove their 15-year-old Honda until the engine finally gave out. Robert, who clipped coupons and compared prices and never, ever splurged on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. "We have everything we need," he used to say when she complained about their threadbare lifestyle. "What more could we want?" "A lot more," Margaret would reply, her voice sharp with frustration. "Some people aren't content to just scrape by, Robert. Some people have ambition." He would just smile at that, a patient, infuriating smile that made her feel like a child having a tantrum. "I'm ambitious about the things that matter," he'd say, and then he'd change the subject or find some excuse to leave the room. Margaret had learned to read that smile as defeat, as the resignation of a man who knew he'd never amount to much. She'd grown tired of defending her husband to friends who wondered why she'd settled for so little, tired of watching other couples buy new houses and take expensive vacations while she and Robert counted pennies. The kettle whistled, pulling her from her thoughts. She made her tea with the same careful economy Robert had taught her. 1 tea bag, steeped for exactly 3 minutes, then saved for a second cup later in the day. Old habits, she thought bitterly. Even now, with Robert gone, she was still pinching pennies like the poor woman she'd apparently always been destined to be. The funeral was tomorrow. She'd arranged everything herself, keeping costs minimal because their savings account held barely enough to cover the basic expenses. The cheapest casket, the smallest possible service, a brief graveside ceremony with refreshments afterward in the church basement. It was what Robert would have wanted, she told herself. He'd always hated waste. Margaret had called Robert's former colleagues from the manufacturing company, a handful of neighbors, and her own small circle of friends. She expected perhaps 20 people to attend, enough to make the service respectable, but not so many as to strain their meager budget for the reception. The phone rang, startling her from her calculations. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and didn't recognize the number. "Hello? Mrs. Collins? This is Janet Morrison from Morrison, Whitfield Associates." "I'm sorry, who?" "We're a law firm downtown. I represent your late husband's estate. I was hoping we could meet before the funeral tomorrow to discuss some matters regarding his will." Margaret frowned. His will? Robert didn't have a will. We talked about getting one made, but we never got around to it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Collins, I'm afraid there may be some confusion. Your husband retained our services 3 years ago to draft a comprehensive will and estate plan. We've been managing certain aspects of his affairs since that time. That's impossible. Robert never mentioned any lawyers. We don't have the money for lawyers. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Collins, perhaps it would be better if we met in person. Would it be possible for you to come to our office this afternoon? I think there are some things about your husband's financial situation that may come as a surprise to you. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of surprise? The kind that's better discussed face to face. Would 2 o'clock work for you? Margaret agreed to the meeting, though her mind was spinning as she hung up the phone. Lawyers didn't work for free, and she knew exactly how much money Robert had left behind because she'd been managing their finances for years. Their checking account held $2,847. Their savings account held $8,122. There was nothing else, no investments, no hidden accounts, no assets beyond their small house and Robert's aging Honda. So what could a law firm possibly want with Robert's estate? The offices of Morrison, Whitfield Associates occupied the top 3 floors of one of the city's most prestigious downtown buildings. Margaret felt underdressed in her discount store dress and worn coat as she rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, surrounded by mahogany paneling and brass fixtures that probably cost more than her monthly budget. Janet Morrison was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and an expensive suit that screamed competence and discretion. She greeted Margaret warmly and led her to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Collins. I know this must be a difficult time." "Ms. Morrison, I think there's been some mistake. My husband was a bookkeeper. He didn't have the kind of money that requires." All this. Margaret gestured around the opulent conference room. Janet Morrison opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a thick folder. "Mrs. Collins, how much do you know about your husband's financial affairs?" "Everything. I balanced our checkbook. I paid our bills. I managed our savings. We had maybe $11,000 total." "And you were aware of all his income sources?" "Of course. His salary from the manufacturing company, and then his pension after he retired. That was it." Janet Morrison nodded slowly. "Mrs. Collins, your husband asked me to handle this conversation with particular care. He was very specific about how he wanted this information to be shared with you." She opened the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope, with Margaret's name written on it in Robert's careful handwriting. "He asked me to give you this first before we discuss the details of his estate." Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was heavy, expensive, nothing like the cheap stationery they used at home. She tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Margaret," it began, and her eyes filled with tears at the sight of his familiar handwriting. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and Janet is about to tell you things that will probably shock you. I want you to know that every decision I made about money, about our life together, was made out of love for you, though I fear you may not see it that way at first. I have been wealthy for most of our marriage, not from my job at the manufacturing company, though I did work there and did earn that modest salary. My wealth came from investments, from a business I inherited from my father, and from careful financial planning that began long before I met you. When we first started dating, I was recently divorced. My first wife left me when she discovered that I wasn't as wealthy as she had assumed. She had married me believing I could provide her with a life of luxury, and when she learned that I preferred to live simply despite my means, she felt deceived. The divorce was bitter, expensive, and taught me that money complicates love in ways I never want to experience again. So when I met you, I decided to see if you could love me for myself, not for what I could provide. I know this seems deceptive, and perhaps it was, but Margaret, you showed me such genuine affection in those early days when you thought I was just a poor bookkeeper. You loved my sense of humor, my Sunday morning pancakes, the way I sang off-key in the shower. You loved me when you thought I had nothing to offer but myself. I should have told you the truth after we married, but I was afraid. Afraid that knowing about the money would change you, change us. And then years passed, and it became harder and harder to find the right moment, the right words. I know you have been frustrated with our simple lifestyle. I know you have wished for more, and I know you have sometimes seen me as a failure because I couldn't, or wouldn't, provide it. This has been the greatest pain of my life, watching you struggle with disappointment while knowing I could have given you everything you wanted. But Margaret, I wanted to give you something more valuable than money. I wanted to give you the knowledge that you are loved completely for exactly who you are. I wanted us to build a life based on who we are together, not what we can buy or where we can go or what we can show off to others. I hope someday you will understand that I kept this secret not to hurt you, but to protect something precious. The pure love we found in that little apartment where we first lived, when we were happy with just each other and a shared cup of coffee on Sunday mornings. Janet will explain everything about the estate. I have provided for you, of course, but I have also tried to use my wealth in ways that would make you proud. I have been an anonymous donor to many causes, and I have helped people in our community in ways they will never know came from us. I love you, Margaret. I have loved you every day for 32 years, through every frustrated word about money, through every disappointed sigh when you looked at our old furniture or our small house. I loved you because you deserved to be loved, not because of what you could give me or what I could give you. Forgive me for keeping this secret. Forgive me for letting you think I was a failure when I was actually trying to be a different kind of success. All my love, always, Robert. Margaret read the letter twice, then looked up at Janet Morrison through eyes blurred with tears. How much? She whispered. Janet Morrison consulted her papers. Your husband's total estate is valued at approximately $2 million. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the conference table, struggling to process what she'd just heard. That's impossible. The bulk of it comes from investments and a small manufacturing business he inherited from his father and grew over the years. He lived off his salary from his day job and reinvested all profits from the business. He was extremely financially conservative and quite brilliant at building wealth quietly. Margaret stared at the lawyer, trying to reconcile this information with the man who had darned his own socks and driven their car until the wheels nearly fell off. What? What does the will say? Janet Morrison pulled out a document. He has left you the house, of course, and $1 million outright. The remainder has been divided among various charitable organizations, with the largest portion going to a scholarship fund for children from low-income families. He gave away $3 million. $3.2 million, yes. But Mrs. Collins, there's more. He has been making anonymous donations to several families in your neighborhood for years. The Hendersons next door. Their son's college tuition was paid by your husband. Mrs. Patterson down the street. Her medical bills after her cancer diagnosis were covered by your husband. The Martinez family. When Mr. Martinez was laid off 2 years ago, it was your husband who anonymously paid their mortgage for 6 months. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. I don't understand. How could I not know? How could he hide this from me for 32 years? He was very careful, Mrs. Collins. He used our firm to manage the investments and donations. All the paperwork came here. He paid us out of his business account, which you never saw because he kept it completely separate from your household finances. But why? Why would he live like we were poor when we weren't? Janet Morrison's expression softened. I think, Mrs. Collins, that your husband believed he was rich in ways that had nothing to do with money, and he wanted to make sure you felt the same way. The funeral the next day was not the small, modest affair Margaret had planned. She arrived at the church to find the parking lot nearly full, with cars she didn't recognize lining the street for blocks. Inside, the simple arrangement of flowers she'd ordered had been joined by elaborate displays that filled the front of the church with color and fragrance. Margaret took her place in the front pew, bewildered by the crowd of people filling the church behind her. She recognized some faces, neighbors, Robert's former co-workers, her own friends, but there were dozens of others she'd never seen before. Well-dressed strangers, some in expensive suits, some in the careful Sunday best of working families. Children clutching flowers, elderly couples holding hands, young adults who looked like college students. All of them here for Robert, her Robert, who she'd thought lived such a small, unremarkable life. The service began with the pastor's familiar words about Robert's kindness and community spirit, but as it continued, other people rose to speak. People Margaret had never met, with stories about her husband she'd never heard. A young woman with tears streaming down her face talked about how an anonymous scholarship had allowed her to become the first person in her family to graduate from college, and how she'd only learned yesterday that it had come from Robert Collins. An elderly man spoke about a time when his wife had been in the hospital and they couldn't afford the medical bills. An anonymous donor had covered everything, he said, and he'd spent years wondering who had saved his family from bankruptcy. Yesterday, he learned it was Robert. A middle-aged woman talked about the community garden that Robert had quietly funded for 15 years, providing fresh vegetables for families who couldn't afford them, never asking for recognition or credit. Story after story, person after person, each one revealing another piece of the life Robert had lived in secret. Margaret sat in stunned silence, recognizing glimpses of the man she'd married but discovering depths she'd never known existed. After the service, as people filed past her to offer their condolences, Margaret began to understand the true extent of her husband's hidden life. "He saved our house," one woman whispered, pressing Margaret's hand. "When my husband lost his job, we were 3 months behind on payments. Someone paid it all anonymously. We never knew who until yesterday." "He bought my daughter's wedding dress," another woman said. "She was so heartbroken that she couldn't afford the one she wanted. Someone at the store said it had been paid for by a friend. We always wondered who." "He fixed my roof after the storm," an elderly man told her. "Sent a crew over, everything paid for. Wouldn't take a penny. Said it was covered by a community fund I'd never heard of." Margaret listened to each story with growing amazement and growing shame. For 32 years, she had lived with a man she thought she knew completely, and it turned out she hadn't known him at all. The graveside service was brief, conducted in a light rain that seemed appropriate for the grey sorrow in Margaret's heart. But as they lowered Robert's casket into the ground, something unexpected happened. The crowd, easily 100 people now, began to sing. Not a hymn or a traditional funeral song, but Happy Birthday, sung softly and sweetly by dozens of voices. Margaret looked around in confusion until the pastor leaned over to explain. "It was something your husband did," he said quietly. Whenever he helped someone anonymously, he would send a card with their gift that said, "Think of this as a birthday present from a friend, a chance to start fresh." People started calling him the birthday angel, though none of them knew his real name until now. As the singing faded and people began to drift away, Margaret remained at the graveside, trying to process everything she'd learned in the past 24 hours. Janet Morrison approached with an umbrella and a small box. "There's one more thing, Mrs. Collins. Your husband asked me to give this to you after the funeral." Inside the box was a simple gold locket, old-fashioned and clearly not expensive. Margaret opened it to find a photo of herself from their early dating days, young and laughing, and a folded piece of paper with Robert's handwriting. "This was my real treasure," the note said. "Not the money, not the investments, not the business. This smile, this laugh, this woman who loved me when she thought I was nobody special. You made me rich, Margaret. You just didn't know it." Margaret closed the locket and looked down at Robert's grave. The headstone was simple granite with just his name and dates, exactly as she'd ordered when she thought they couldn't afford anything elaborate. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the fresh earth. "I'm so sorry I didn't see. I'm sorry I made you feel like you weren't enough when you were everything." The rain began to fall harder, and Janet Morrison gently took her arm. "Come on, Mrs. Collins, let's get you home." But home felt different now. As Margaret walked through the rooms where she and Robert had lived their supposedly simple life, she saw everything with new eyes. The old furniture wasn't shabby, it was carefully chosen and lovingly maintained. The small house wasn't cramped, it was cozy and efficient. The modest lifestyle wasn't the result of poverty, it was the choice of a man who found richness in things that couldn't be bought. She found herself in Robert's study, a tiny room off the kitchen where he used to pay bills and read his books. For the first time she really looked at his bookshelf. Philosophy, poetry, books about investing and business, volumes on charity and social justice. Books that suggested a much deeper, more thoughtful man than she'd ever given him credit for. In his desk drawer she found more evidence of the life he'd kept secret. Thank you letters from charities, photos from community events she'd never known he attended, receipts for gifts and donations that added up to thousands of dollars over the years. And at the back of the drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small velvet box. Inside was a diamond ring, not huge, but elegant and clearly expensive. A note was tucked beneath it. For our 35th anniversary, I was finally going to tell you everything and ask you to marry me all over again, this time knowing exactly who you were marrying. R. Margaret sat in Robert's chair and cried until she had no tears left. She cried for the conversations they'd never had, for the appreciation she'd never shown, for the man she'd spent 32 years underestimating. She cried for the future they wouldn't have, where she might have learned to see him clearly while he was still alive to know it. But most of all, she cried because she finally understood what Robert had been trying to show her all along. He had been rich, incredibly, abundantly rich, in all the ways that mattered. He had lived a life of purpose and generosity and quiet heroism, and she had missed it completely because she was looking for wealth in bank statements instead of in character. The phone began ringing with calls from friends and neighbors who had attended the funeral, all of them wanting to share their amazement at the revelations about Robert. Margaret let the calls go to the answering machine, not yet ready to talk about her husband's secret life or her own blindness to it. Instead, she made herself a simple dinner and sat at their small kitchen table, wearing the locket Robert had left for her. She thought about all the evenings they'd sat here together, Robert contentedly reading his book while she flipped through catalogues of things they couldn't afford, dreaming of a different life. How many times had she sighed with frustration at their circumstances? How many times had she made little cutting remarks about their financial situation? How many times had she made Robert feel inadequate for failing to provide luxuries that he could actually have afforded easily? Margaret opened the locket and looked at the photo of her younger self, trying to remember the woman who had fallen in love with Robert Collins, the bookkeeper. That woman had been happy with simple pleasures, walks in the park, picnics on the beach, quiet evenings at home. That woman had appreciated Robert's gentle humor, his thoughtfulness, his steady presence in her life. When had she lost that appreciation? When had she started keeping score of what she didn't have instead of treasuring what she did? Margaret knew the answer, even if she didn't like it. It had happened gradually over years of comparing her life to others, years of wanting more instead of being grateful for enough. She had let dissatisfaction poison her contentment, let envy blind her to the treasure she'd already found. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings and financial arrangements. Margaret learned that Robert's business had been even more successful than Janet Morrison had initially indicated. He had been a silent partner in several ventures and had made investments that had grown exponentially over the years. But more than the money, she discovered the extent of his charitable work. The scholarship fund was just the beginning. Robert had quietly funded a dozen different programs in their community, from a food bank to a shelter for homeless families to a program that provided free tutoring for struggling students. He had been a patron of the arts, anonymously sponsoring local theater productions and music programs. He had funded medical research and disaster relief efforts. He had been, in every sense of the word, a philanthropist, though no one had known his name. He was very adamant about the anonymity, Janet Morrison explained during one of their meetings. He never wanted recognition or credit. He said the point of giving was to help, not to be seen helping. Margaret began to understand that Robert's secrecy hadn't just been about hiding his wealth from her. It had been a fundamental part of his character. He had been a man who did good works in private, who found satisfaction in the act of giving, rather than in the recognition it might bring. She also began to receive visits from some of the people Robert had helped over the years. The young woman who had spoken at his funeral came by to share photos from her college graduation, explaining how Robert's scholarship had not only paid for her education, but had inspired her to start her own program, helping underprivileged children. The elderly man, whose medical bills had been covered, brought Margaret a hand-carved wooden box that he'd made in Robert's honor, telling her stories about her husband's quiet visits to the hospital where his wife had been treated. Each visitor added another layer to Margaret's understanding of the man she'd been married to. Robert hadn't just been wealthy, he had been wise. He hadn't just had money, He had understood how to use it in ways that truly mattered. Margaret began to see that Robert's simple lifestyle hadn't been about denying himself pleasure or being cheap. It had been about understanding that real satisfaction came from meaningful relationships and purposeful actions, not from accumulating possessions. He had been rich in the truest sense of the word, and he had spent his wealth in the most valuable way possible, by enriching other people's lives. 3 months after Robert's death, Margaret made a decision. She called Janet Morrison and asked to set up a meeting. "I want to continue what Robert was doing," she said. "The charitable work, the anonymous giving. I don't need all this money, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand what Robert was trying to teach me." Janet Morrison smiled. "He would be very pleased to hear you say that, Mrs. Collins. He left very specific instructions for how to continue his charitable work if you were interested. He hoped that someday you might want to join him in it, even if it had to be after he was gone." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. Even in death, Robert had been thinking of her, hoping she would eventually understand the life he'd been trying to share with her all along. "There's one more thing," Janet Morrison said, handing Margaret another sealed envelope. "He asked me to give you this if you ever decided to continue his work." Inside was another letter in Robert's careful handwriting. "My darling Margaret, if you are reading this, it means you have chosen to carry on the work that brought me so much joy during my lifetime. I cannot tell you how happy this makes me, even from beyond the grave. I know you may think that I deceived you by hiding my wealth, and perhaps I did, but I hope you will come to see that I was trying to give you something more valuable than money. I was trying to give you the chance to discover your own capacity for love, generosity, and joy. You have always been rich in kindness, rich in intelligence, rich in strength. I wanted you to know those riches first before the complication of money entered our lives. I wanted you to love me for the man I was, and I wanted to love you for the woman you are, without the weight of expectations that wealth can bring. Now you have the chance to use material wealth in service of the spiritual wealth that has always been within you. I know you will do beautiful things with it, because I have watched you do beautiful things with nothing but your own generous heart for 32 years. Thank you for loving me when you thought I was ordinary. Thank you for building a life with me that was extraordinary in all the ways that truly matter. Thank you for being exactly who you are, the woman who made me feel wealthy every single day, whether you knew it or not. Use this gift wisely, my love. Use it joyfully. And know that wherever I am proud of you and grateful for every moment we shared. All my love, forever. Robert P.S. Start with the Martinez family. Their daughter wants to be a doctor, but they can't afford medical school. I was going to surprise them for Christmas, but now it can be a surprise from both of us. Margaret folded the letter carefully and looked out the window of the law office at the city below. Somewhere down there were people who needed help, families who were struggling, dreams that could be fulfilled with the right support at the right time. For 32 years, she had been married to a man who understood that true wealth wasn't about what you could buy for yourself, but about what you could give to others. She had been married to a man who found richness in simplicity, abundance in generosity, and treasure in love freely given. She had spent those 32 years thinking she was poor, when all along she had been married to one of the richest men who ever lived. "Janet," Margaret said, turning back to the lawyer, "I'd like to start with the Martinez family, and then I think it's time I learned how to be as wealthy as my husband was." As she left the law office that day, Margaret felt Robert's presence beside her in a way she hadn't experienced since his death. She could almost hear his gentle voice, the one that had tried to tell her for decades that they had everything they needed. Now, finally, she understood what he had meant. They had been rich all along. Rich in love, rich in purpose, rich in the quiet satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. The money had just been a tool for sharing that richness with others. Margaret walked home through the familiar streets of their modest neighborhood, seeing it with new eyes. This was where Robert had chosen to live, not because he couldn't afford better, but because this was where he could do the most good. This was where the Hendersons lived, and the Pattersons, and the Martinez family with their daughter who dreamed of becoming a doctor. This was where Robert had been happiest, surrounded by people he could help, living a life that mattered in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love. Margaret realized that she was finally ready to be truly wealthy, in all the ways Robert had tried to teach her. She was ready to be rich, not in possessions, but in purpose, not in status, but in service, not in what she could accumulate, but in what she could give away. She was ready to be the woman Robert had always seen in her, even when she couldn't see it herself. As she reached her front door, Margaret touched the locket at her throat and whispered a promise to the man who had loved her enough to keep his greatest secret until she was ready to understand it. I see you now, Robert. I finally see you, and I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to see the world the way you did, full of opportunities to make someone else's life a little brighter, a little easier, a little more hopeful. She opened the door to their small, perfect house and stepped inside, ready to begin the life Robert had always hoped they could share together. A life of true wealth, measured not in dollars but in the difference they could make in the world. For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret felt genuinely rich.